Vishu is going to take a second lecture today. I think this today is going to be fun, and I hope you don't lose your enthusiasm as we enter these last 3 days. As usual, the mics are available if you need to ask questions.
Okay, hi everyone, welcome back. So as I promised, today I will give a slightly more hands-on mathematical tutorial, or a discussion-like thing, where we sort of dig ourselves into some mathematical details, but without losing the broader perspective. So my goal is that whatever calculations we do is in service of interesting set of questions that we would like to address. Okay, so now so let's just recap a bit where what we have been doing broadly. So in ecology, in theoretical ecology, we love mathematical models, right? So we would write the simplest and most classic mathematical model would be the logistic population model. Okay, and in fact, even in my talk, I use this as a starting point and introduced some additional nonlinear terms and showed how you get bistable dynamics, right? So now, now let us ask a very simple question. Now, if I wanted to introduce stochasticity to this population model, how do I go about this? So one strategy is what I sort of discussed in the previous talk, which is let us go near a stable equilibrium. Okay, let me stay near a stable equilibrium. If I stay near a stable equilibrium, and if I assume that the system will stay near the stable equilibrium, I can linearize the system, right? Okay, I can ignore the nonlinear terms. So if x was the deviation from the stable equilibrium, the deterministic equation would look like this. Okay, and this is true independent of what the original equation was. It's always true. I take any stable equilibrium, I look near this will always be true. And the strategy was, okay, let me add some stochasticity on top of this. Okay, this was the strategy, and then we analyze this equation. This is the classic physics approach of how do we sort of understand stochasticity in various systems. Now, of course, the challenge, I think, to me, this is not always very satisfactory for a few reasons. One of the reasons being that, maybe the stochasticity is quite high, right? In which case, the linear approximation I made may not be really good. So the stochasticity may not keep the system sufficiently close to the equilibrium to be able to assume that I can drop all the nonlinear terms. Okay, so that is one issue. A second issue is that, if you think of real ecological systems, there are a variety of processes such as birth, death, migration, immigration, mutation, and so on and so forth, right? Every one of these is a stochastic event. Okay, but what we are really doing is, writing a deterministic equation using some sort of broad, phenomenological or intuitive understanding. Okay, so the question then is, is it somehow possible to link the stochasticity at the level of microscopic interactions? Can we begin there and then derive an equation that captures the stochasticity in a much more faithful way? Okay, so, and if you do that, I don't have to be exercising these kind of ad hoc introduction of noise. And one more thing, the third point is, as I showed you in the example such as this, so I just made up this term, right? I just assumed that the stochasticity is not additive anymore. But why would anybody do it? I assume this structure, you may assume some other structure and get some other weird result. Or maybe my results were weird because that's never really going to happen in real world. To sort of address all these issues, we will be in a much better footing if we start with microscopic stochastic processes that are relevant to the biological problem, and then we then derive the that accounts for stochasticity. So this is our goal today. So we would like to start from basic local interactions, as we call them. So microscopic need not mean I have to look at them in a microscope. It just means that they are sort of, sufficiently small scale or local interactions. Macroscopic again need not mean thermodynamically large system as we usually do in physics, but it could really be also at the level of populations which are finite. Where the stochastic interactions are really important. And in fact, when you probably learned this, one of the things you would have learned is that when we write this equation, we have ignored a whole bunch of things. Obviously stochasticity, and we have ignored the spatial structure of the system, right? We are treating the entire ecological system as a that can be described by a single density variable without worrying about how this density is spread in space. And we also ignore other more complicated biological features, like the fact that the age structure is not constant in the population and so on and so forth. There are lots of assumptions. What we would like to do is to sort of focus on the stochastic process part here. Okay, so that's the broad goal. To do that, what I will do is to introduce, because it's, I can do a general framework, but that probably becomes very mathematical. So what I would do is I will first introduce a model, which is stochastic and spatial. Which means it has two very interesting and important biological realistic components. In addition, I will also treat individuals as discrete. So here there was no concept of individuals. So it was, we were treating the entire population as a density, right? So I will start here, and then we will sort of go from these microscopic interactions of birth and death to an equation of this form. Do we get logistic model at all, or do we get something entirely different? I just hope this has not been covered in the last 10 days. Oh, nope. Okay, that's great. I'm asking this too late, of course, because I cannot magically create a new lecture, but still good to know. Okay, great. So what I will do is I will introduce a model called contact process. So in this, so there are slightly different variants of how you introduce this model, but this is the way I'm going to introduce. So you assume that there is a lattice, okay? So this the ecological landscape we are interested can be thought of as a lattice. But as I said, there are slightly different presentations of the same model. I'm doing the way typically physicists do, mathematicians do in a slightly different way. So keep it in mind. And each site can have one individual. Okay, at max, it can have an individual, or it may have nobody. So think of this, and let's say you randomly fill this with zeros and ones. Zeros indicating that there is nobody on this cell, one indicating that there is one individual. Okay, so sort of you sort of start with some configuration. So now, from this configuration, we define a birth and death process. Okay. So what we do is we randomly pick an individual. We randomly pick a site. If that site has nothing, it basically has 0. Then I pick one more until I hit 1. So I keep, I keep finding a random site until I find a site which is occupied, and the probability 1 minus p, this site dies, meaning this individual on this site dies. Okay. So this also, I did the exactly opposite of what I said I would do. Death. Okay. With the remaining probability p, what I will do is I will look for a neighbor, one of the 4 nearest neighbors. Okay, let's say that this was the site I have picked. So now that this, so with the probability p, what I will now do is I will look for one of the neighbors. And that neighbor is not occupied. If the neighbor happens to be this, okay, then with the probability p, that neighbor is now germinated and becomes occupied. So the neighbor gets colonized by the parent individual. So there are many different ways you can think of this. This could be, for example, I think one of the original formalisms thought of this as spread of infection. So 0 means it's a population of all susceptible individuals who are not infected, and 1s are those who are infected. So with some probability p, you infect a neighbor. Okay, on the other hand, you die yourself because of the infection. That's one interpretation. But this is also used in many different contexts, such as trees and grasses in savanna forest ecosystems. So these could be, for example, one vegetation type colonizing a nearby vegetation type. Okay, for example, this could be a shrub or a woodland which could colonize a nearby grassland with some probability p, but can also die and get colonized by grasses. Okay, so question. So this 1, 0, 1 remains as it is, but the neighboring 0 has become 1. That's what we want to find out. Will that happen? Will everything become 1, 1? Or okay, that's a. So you're setting up the stage, yes.
And the fact that the p's are the same, that the rate, I mean, sort of 1
So you
minus
could
p
assume, it doesn't matter. You can assume this is D.
Otherwise, that would be like the population.
I'm just trying to reduce the number of parameters, like a standard physicist and mathematicians would always love to do, right? And if it was 1, 1, I don't do anything. I'll just go back to drawing the site.
Just about the technical details, are you for every pair of empty, non-empty site, are you drawing something with P, or are you first figuring out whether you want to reproduce or not, and then picking a site at random?
Yes, that's so basically what you do is you do decide first whether you want to reproduce. If you decide, then you look for the neighbor.
Okay,
that's one easy interpretation. If you decide not to reproduce, you'll die. I mean, you don't decide, so in that sense.
Yeah.
So don't take the word decision too seriously. Yes. In the simple model, yes. In the contact process, yes. Sanjay, you want to say something?
Just clarification of the rule.
Yeah, sure.
So you said you start and you look at a site until you find a site which has a 1.
Yes.
There you face a choice first with probability D.
Yeah.
You set it equal to 0.
Yeah. So usually, I mean, I should have done, maybe let me just change this. I messed up. Truly, I messed up. Okay, what I will do with the probability P, I will first do this. Okay, and then if that doesn't happen, with probability 1 minus P, I die. Let me just make it very clear. I think the sample space will be better this way.
Okay.
And if I had done that.
So if this neighboring site 1 does not have any zeros, then the first option is irrelevant?
Yes, yes, yes.
So only if there is a zero site, do you
Yes.
consider even the fact that you might want to reproduce?
So the way we usually implement is first to decide with the probability P what to do, and then look for neighbors. If there is if there is no option for reproduction, now I pick another site.
Okay.
That site is now not going to do anything, just like the zeros. So there are also many no updates in this scenario. For example, if I pick a 0, no update happens. If I pick 1, and if I want to reproduce, if I pick 1, 1, nothing happens. So then so basically n square number of draws will effectively be equivalent to drawing on an average everyone. That would be what one type step in this set of rules. Okay.
So once you become 100, there's a zero neighbor. There is one.
Again, here's the thing. I don't look for a 0 and then I reproduce there. I look for a random neighbor, and if the random neighbor happens to be 0, then only I reproduce.
But then how do you, there should be another probability associated with picking the neighbor then?
So I pick the neighbor for sure. Okay. Then if that is 0, then this event will happen. If the neighbor had a 1, nothing happens. 1, 1 remains 1, 1. Okay. Is that clear?
You choose to either choose reproduction or death.
Yes. Yes.
That is the step.
So that is the sort of two possible events, right? I choose the reproduction or the death. The reproduction happens with the probability P, death happens with the probability 1 minus P. Once I choose the reproduction, whether this happens or not depends on the neighborhood configuration. So that probability I'm not writing it here. That will come in the calculations. Okay. Yes.
Always give birth or death, because I don't think the birth and death probability should be related.
You're right. This could be a different parameter, but in the simplest model, that's what we do. Because in fact, I will send you a reference where we have a different parameter D here.
If you choose a 1, 1, can death happen then, or like nothing happens?
Not in this model.
Not in this one.
Not in this model. Yes. If you choose 1, 1, no birth happens, no death happens. Okay.
If you choose a 0, there should be something happening, right? Like,
if I choose a 0, I pick again, nothing happens. So these are all the scenarios. 0 remains 0. 1, 1 remains 1, 1. What other things? No, these two I have already written down, right? So these two are the scenarios where nothing happens. So if I pick 0, nothing happens. If I choose the reproduction, but if I pick 1, 1, nothing happens again. Okay.
but like if you have a 0 and a neighboring 1, that can back propagate the disease, let's say, or modeling disease. So
this is, so you are sort of thinking of second order effects of the rules, right? So those should come out in the calculations.
okay.
So what you're saying is, if I pick a 0, that fellow might actually get germinated because somebody else was there.
Yeah.
But that is not the microscopic rule, though. That's an effect because of the neighbor on me. So, but the way I have defined the rules is this way, which is complete in itself.
Okay.
Okay, is that clear? So, so now having done this, what is the next thing we should? So we have defined the model. It looks incredibly simple, and it is incredibly simple, right? What is a possible outcome of this? Would everyone would the entire landscape get filled with ones after a sufficiently large amount of time? Would that time just depend on P, for example? Or do you need a critical amount of P is basically like the birth rate, right? So would you need a critical amount of birth rate? Is that when entire landscape gets filled? Or do you need a critical amount of birth rate when? So basically, it's not very clear because stochastic processes are slightly more complex than we think they are. Okay. So let us see what happens. So now to understand, so now we have defined the rules. Now let me sort of broadly write down the strategy for sort of solving these sorts of stochastic individual, they're called stochastic individual based models. How do we go from microscopic rules of this type to sort of population level dynamics? So there are many approaches to sort of solve this problem. So I will outline an approach that physicists often use, and we will do one step at a time. So it's useful to understand the broad strategy of how this can be solved. And by no means this is the only way. There are many, many different ways. Okay. So broadly, and in fact, this is precisely what Jacopo sort of outlined in his talk as well. So first thing we do is okay. Second thing you would do is identify your state variable. What do you really want to study? Right? So here we have to arrive at some decision of what is our state variable going to be. There is some very straightforward choice which we will choose. Once you have identified the state variable, you basically write the transition probabilities. Or rates. Okay, so let's denote that by T. So if rho is the state variable, this T matrix basically tells the transition probabilities. If rho prime is the current state, and this object tells me what is the probability of transitioning from rho prime to rho. Okay, it's a transition rate. Okay, now that leads us to the master equation. Once you know the state variable and the transition probabilities, it sort of brings us to the master equation. Was it discussed again yesterday? Okay. Yes. Okay. So you know why we need master equation now? So in the logistic model, if I knew the initial value of the density, I can tell with infinite precision how it will change over time, how the density will change over time, because everything there is deterministic, right? But that is not the case here anymore. Even if I know the initial conditions extremely precisely, and even if I know all the rules precisely in probabilistic terms, in one realization, I might take a trajectory like this. I might take a slightly different trajectory in the next instance. So there are many possible outcomes. So I cannot talk of a single trajectory anymore. So what we would be interested in is, what is the probability that I have to think of the probability of having the density at time t. Given maybe that I had some initial density at time t is equal to 0. Given that, how does that state variable change with time? And this is basically given by the master equation. This is a partial differential equation. Okay. So what you basically, one way to think about this graphically would be this. So this is the, let me come to your question in a moment. So this is the axis of your state variable. This is rho prime. Let's say this is rho. So basically, I want to know at time t, what's the problem. So I have to look at what are all the different ways I can reach this. Okay, now there are basically, to do this, we have to think of the following. There are two things that can happen. A value that is lower than rho can bring me to rho. A value that is greater than rho can bring me to rho. That's the inflow to the state I'm interested in. That's the inflow rate. Okay. So imagine that I am at some p rho prime. Okay. What's the probability that rho prime will transition to rho? So here's the inflow rate. So I was at rho prime. This is the rate of transition to rho. That's the inflow rate. On the other hand, maybe I was already at rho. I was maybe already here. So I have to now think of a system that will flow away from rho if I was already at rho in the previous instant, right? So therefore, I was already at rho. So I now have to think of rho becoming rho prime. So this transition, for those of you who are not from physics and math background, this notation might take some time. So the way to read this is the second term. This is where I was, and this is where I'm going. Transition is from this to this element. So think of this way. Okay, not the other way. So when that's the notation that's often used, this is the outflow rate. So basically, rate of change of probability density at time t is given by the inflow rate to that state minus the outflow rate to that state. Okay, so basically what we do is, does this intuitively make sense? You don't need a derivation for this, right? Okay, so this is a very general and important equation. So having done this, what we will now do is, we will now formulate the transition rates for this microscopic model. So there were two questions, okay, Naveen and then.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, I mean, maybe I'm missing this, but like this seems there's no spatial component yet here.
Yes, yeah. That's a very good point. So for today's talk, I will not get to space. I will start with a spatial system just to sort of make sure we have all these interesting components. We will then ask, okay, now if I ignore space, but I want to treat stochasticity, how do I do that? But there are master equations that can account for space as well. But I'm not going to do that because this already is sufficiently mathematical for several students. Yes, you have a question? Mm-hmm. I didn't get your question, sorry. Just 1 second, I forgot the row. So you have to sum over all row prime here. What's the question?
Say you are already at row.
So
you are not changing when you reach a time. Like you should add a probability that you are already at row.
That's what I'm doing here, no? I'm at row and I'm transitioning to something else. That's the outflow from the row.
But say you are at row, but you are not like changing.
Oh, I don't change at all. Oh, okay. How do you, like, whatever that happened there, no? So those terms don't appear at all because it's a it doesn't change. It's a rate of change, right? If nothing is changing, it doesn't affect this anyway, right? Does it make sense? Any other questions? Okay, so now having written down this doesn't fully solve the problem. So what we now need to do is, a given set of these stochastic equations, we need to write down what are these things and then see if I can solve the equation. And often this is still very hard. We have to make some assumptions at that stage. And then one assumption that's often made is that the increments are really tiny in a small interval of time, which sort of makes sense. And if you make that assumption, and if you further argue that, hey, look, I'm going to ignore all the higher order terms, I'm considering really short increments in the state variable, and therefore, since, for example, if I'm looking at changes in the density of the order of let's say 10 power minus 2, if my equation has terms like x rho square, rho 4, all those terms are going to contribute very small. So basic assumption we do is ignore all the higher order moments. So this will be a bit clear when I do the full calculation. Then we get to what is called a Fokker-Planck equation. I shouldn't have changed the colors. I don't know where the previous pen is. Okay. So we get to what is called a Fokker-Planck equation. So so basically this is like a checklist of how we will be going in the entire set of scheme of things. So all these terms will be defined eventually for you. Okay. F of rho, P of rho is also P of rho. This is also rho, and there is some noise factor here which I'll come to. This is differentiating with respect to rho. Yes, twice with respect to rho. Okay. It's okay. So just think of the fact that we're going to go from master equation to Fokker-Planck equation. Better, there are many. I'll do that. Should I write this again? No, there are many. There are many. It's just I am losing them. So to make space for myself, I have erased this small diagram. Oh no, this is not writing well. Fokker-Planck equation. Okay, so basically it helps us simplify this. It would look like this. Okay. So sorry, this is rho square. This is n, where n is the number of. So if this was L and this was L, so n is equal to L cross L. Noise term where? So yeah, I replace it with. So I will basically show that this in the context of what I'm going to do, the noise term will basically is equal to 2n. Sigma square will be equal to 2n. Okay, and then finally we go to what is called an eta SDE. So eta SDE is what we really wanted. You remember I just wrote these equations, right? X dot is equal to minus alpha x plus some noise. X dot is equal to minus alpha x plus some more complex term. So from this, we will go to this. Okay. So this is our goal today. Let's see how far we go. Any steps that I cannot, I will not do all the algebra in between, for which I will just refer to some various references. These are all fairly standard techniques in physics. And okay, so this is the goal for today. And we will analyze this once we get there. Okay, so we have a long way to go. Any questions on the strategy of what we're going to do today, plan or strategy? Okay, so we have now done the microscopic rules for a population model. Okay, yes. Everything is rho, yes. Okay, whatever the state variable you have chosen. Okay, and imagine you had 10 state variables. You will now have the P would be a function of all those state variables instead of just one row. Rho is a symbolic state variable for this part of the board, but for for our model, rho will be a very specific quantity which I will define. And the eta SD being a single dimensional equation is again symbolic. It could be a much more complex multidimensional equation if the state variable was again multidimensional. For example, if we had 4 species, then you won't have a single variable equation. You will have 4 coupled stochastic differential equations. Okay, so let's now write down what's the next thing we should do. We have defined the microscopic processes, contact process. Okay, and once you have done, the next thing to do would be write the transition probabilities. Shall we go there now? Okay, cool. So now let us now define the state variable for us. The state variable for us would be, because there are literally only 2 states. Okay, and let us say that for the time being, we will ignore the space, and I want to look at what is the sort of total number of ones. Okay, in this configuration, I don't really care how they are spread. I don't worry about the configuration details, but I will look at the average quantity. Okay. So if n is the number of ones, Okay, if where n is the number of ones. So that we define density is equal to the state variable as the density, which is density of ones. Okay, without worrying about how they are spread. Okay, now what does birth and death do to this density? So that before we even get there, let us ask ourselves, what are the various values density can take? If there are no ones, the value will be 0. If there's only one occupied site in the entire landscape, it would be 1 over n, 2 over n, right? Only 2 sites are occupied, 2 over n, and all the way to 1, where everyone is occupied. So these are all the possible values that density can take. Okay. Discrete values, right? Now we know the density possible values that the densities can take, right? And we would like to now know what are the transition probabilities given these two processes. Okay, so what does birth do to density? It increases by how much? 1 by n, right? Whereas the death does the opposite, which is it decreases by 1 over n. So that basically, if only one of these two events happen, okay, which is true in an extremely small interval, then the density can either increment by 1 over n or reduce by 1 over n. That means I have to really narrow down myself to an extremely small number of transition probability values, right? So basically, if the current density was rho minus 1 over n, how will you get to rho? By a birth. So this would be is equal to, for this to happen, so what is the value of this now? So you need to choose to have a birth, right? So the sort of the event. So let's go back to these rules, right? When does the birth happen? So there are two conditions have to be met. The first, I have to choose a site which is occupied. What is the probability of choosing a site which is occupied? Right, that is n by n, which is rho, right? And then I have to choose to reproduce, which would be p. And then I have to also find a neighbor who is unoccupied. What is the probability of that event? 1 minus rho. You all agree with this? Is this clear? Okay. So now what other transition probabilities do I have to consider? What other way can I get to rho? Yes. I look for one of the 4 neighbors. Okay. So basically, let me sort of split these terms. This is the probability of choosing. The choosing, please be cautious with the word choosing here. So this is the probability of the focal site being 1. So I have to pick this, right? Probability of focal site has to be 1. I have to choose to reproduce, and the neighbor has to be empty. And then this is that clear? That's a very good point. Okay, it's a very, very good point. Okay.
So this, you're assuming it's a sort of well-mixed system. So
okay, this is a very good point. So I think some of you are getting to the sort of, this part is okay. This term is a bit ambiguous. Why is it 1 over minus rho is not necessarily very clear. So this is called a mean field approximation. So this is true under an approximation called So what does it mean? It basically means that my system is sufficiently well mixed. So once and zeros are sufficiently well mixed that the spatial configurations do not really matter. Okay, and if the total density is rho, probability of any site occupied is rho. Probability of a neighbor being occupied or unoccupied doesn't depend on the neighbor's probability. So two nearby cells will have states which are uncorrelated. So that's an assumption I made here. That's really good catch. Yes.
Yeah, so assuming it was spatial between nearest neighbors, you look at the 4 nearest sites and sort of weigh the probabilities by whether it's 0 or 1, and then there'll be a decision if there are multiple 0 sites, which site you go to.
Yeah. It's actually possible to do what you're saying. There is a next level of approximation called pair approximation, where you actually treat pairs as units instead of a single site as a unit. And then you sort of think of pairs as now being a well-mixed system, not the individual units. Okay, so in fact, the reference I'm going to show also does the calculation, assuming that some element of spatial correlation. Okay, but here I'm actually fully throwing the space under the carpet. Okay, literally. Yes. Oh, it's a wrong assumption. It's an assumption. It is not right. It's absolutely not right. In fact, if you do simulations of this, you will realize how horribly wrong it is. True, you're right. It's absolutely wrong. It's true only under some conditions. Okay, the n has to be sufficiently large. That is insufficient. It has to be very large. Both the n and n must be sufficiently large. That is a very minimum necessary condition, but it is insufficient. In fact, even under this being sufficiently large, the spatial correlations are there. If one site is occupied, there is a very high chance that a neighbor would be occupied because of the local birth process. But I'm just throwing that out. Okay. So in fact, as I said, this is one way that I have presented contact process, but there are non-spatial. In fact, the original models of contact process didn't have the spatial structure at all. They would actually present it as to start with as a well-mixed system. But I did this because the reference I am going to do does this. Okay. Is that fine now? So now, once this is clear, now I think how many more transition probabilities are there? Can you make a guess? Because there are only changes of 1 over n units, right? There are not too many. Let's now do the inflow term. See, inflow term means I need to come to rho by all possible means, right? And as I had shown in this diagram, I can come from above, I can come from below. So we have done coming from below, smaller values to rho. How do I come from larger values to rho? How can this happen? Rho plus 1 over n becomes rho. When does this happen? This happens via death. So when does that death happen? Must pick one, which happens with the probability of rho, and then I must then not choose birth, but instead choose death. So imagine, okay, now therefore that is basically 1 minus p into. So now since somebody said, why don't you assume this is an independent parameter? If this was d, okay, then what would this would have been rho times 1 minus p times d. Okay, so just to you have to just carefully keep track of things. If you wanted it to be an independent parameter, that, or you could have also done just d, which is totally independent of this event, but you have to treat the probabilities a bit more carefully. Okay, it could also have been just d times rho, depending on how you define your exact set of rules. Okay, so this is how you get to rho from other values. Now what else can happen? You can also flow out. Can I write here? It's 2 more long rows. So when does this happen? Rho becomes rho 1 minus n. That's again in depth, right? Okay. And then what else can? That would be. What is this? Sorry. Okay. That would be again wave flowing out. That would be, is it same as the previous one? Okay.
Should not the right hand side have had the rho plus 1 over n?
Say that again. This one, no?
Yes.
This should not have had.
Right hand side.
So I'm ignoring another small assumption. Very good. I did realize when I was writing this. So the question was, shouldn't this have been rho plus 1 over n? But assuming n is sufficiently large, I'm going to ignore that. Okay. Let me make sure I have not done any mistakes here. Looking at my notes.
Maybe you need that to get the derivative.
Huh? Sorry.
Maybe I'm wrong, but because maybe you need to have this flow over n to get the derivative.
Do I need? I do need. Yes. Yes. I should not ignore. Okay. So everywhere, yes. Everywhere I should actually include it. Okay. So I think the clever thing to do is define these transition terms only with the second term being rho, so that I don't have to write ugly terms. So what I will do, so I think it's a very, very good catch. Thank you very much for this. I'm not actually ignoring any of this. What I would do instead is actually define only these two, which does not have 1 over n terms. But once you know these two, it's fairly easy to write these two terms. Okay, so thank you very much. Okay, so I will write only these two, but you should be able to write the other by yourself. Okay, and we have still assumed mean field approximation when we have done this. Okay, so what we now need to do is go back to this equation, right? Okay, so which is now a complex messy equation, as you can imagine. Now, how many terms will this have? This will have 2 terms, right? This will have 2 terms. There will be basically a total of 4 terms, 2 terms here, 2 plus 2 terms here. Some having this 1 minus n, 1 over n term with the minus sign, some having 1 over n terms with the positive sign. It's all a bit of a mess. Okay, but there are some tricks you can now begin to use, and the trick is called the idea, okay, of operators. So I want to keep this. So let's define something called an operator. When this operator acts on a function with rho, it basically increments this by 1 over n. Okay. On the other hand, there's another operator called epsilon minus. If this acts on a function h, it decrements it by 1 over n. Okay. So why am I doing this? Because it really helps me write the equations in an easier way. So now once you have this, now what we can now do is we can define the transition probabilities. Okay, let us now think of, so this is a transition probability that corresponds to death, right? So I will actually define T minus, okay, as transition probability corresponding to death. So I will call this as T minus of rho, and I will call this as T plus of rho. because this corresponds to incrementing. Rho has incremented by 1. Okay, T plus of rho. So with these definitions, I have now defined two operators and have also defined, given a slightly different notation, corresponding to birth. Now, if you do a bit of algebra, okay, and if you're a bit patient, it will turn out that what was now a very messy equation which had 4 different terms with various 1 over n terms hanging around becomes a much simpler equation. Now this is an algebra that I would encourage you to do it yourself. This is how the equation would look like, which is in my laptop here. So I will first look at one equation and write it carefully. I already forgot by the time I came here that it was positive or negative. Okay. So the first term would be T plus of rho. Okay, so what we have done is we have used this operator. Basically, what this means is this operator is acting on this entire term here. Okay, so but it really helps us to write it in a much more compact way. This is the first trick we will use, that of E plus. Yes, thank you. So this is a very useful trick. And the second useful trick you use as follows, which is what does this operator does, right? It increments by 1 over n unit. It's basically incrementing the rho by an extremely small quantity. Now, whenever you have a function which has some initial or some value with a small increment, what are you tempted to do? You always do a Taylor series expansion. Okay, so whenever you have the f of x plus a small thing, you always do a Taylor expansion. Okay, so why not? Should do it. Is that right? So we can always do this. So so basically you can think of, so this is how the epsilon acts on H, right? So you can basically think of epsilon itself as okay with higher order terms. So basically what I have done is I have expanded the step operator in terms of the derivatives. Okay. If you now again do something similar for the step operator that corresponds to the death term, you would have a minus term here, but this sign here doesn't change. Higher order terms. So now what you basically do is you had a funny trick here, which can be expanded as a Taylor series, and then you note that what you have in both of these terms is epsilon minus 1 and epsilon plus minus 1. So if I take this to the left hand side here, in this equation what we can do is we can replace epsilon minus 1 with these terms. I can replace epsilon plus 1 with, I replace epsilon plus 1 with these terms. I can replace epsilon minus 1 with these terms. Okay. Is that clear? And I am going to ignore everything above second derivative because n is a very large number. I'm going to assume that this lattice is sufficiently large that I can do two things. That I can think of rho as a continuous variable. By the way, when I did this, I have sort of, done some crazy hand waving in saying that rho, which was changing in units of 1 over n, even if that is the case, I can still take as if the corresponding functions are continuous, which means that I'm treating n to be sufficiently large for both to be able to drop the term as well as to treat rho as continuous. Okay, so this is a very important and crucial assumption. In addition to the fact that I had made a mean field approximation. Yes.
This is interesting because in all the previous lectures when we've done any sort of Taylor expansion, we ignore like second order terms also. Here, like very arbitrary, there's like ignoring from third order terms. So like, is there any sanctity using process?
Great, good point. Anybody else? Anybody else can answer?
They cancel out.
Higher order terms, huh? No, not everything will cancel out.
The first one.
This will cancel out. No, this won't cancel out. No, they will be there. Both the terms are going to be there. I should in principle keep everything. Okay, so one general principle is that, so this is called what we call, broadly called moment closure approximations. These ideas come under the idea of moment closure approximations. So for many, first of all, the assumption that the mean field approximation, it is same as saying that when I am doing moments of two variables, I can treat them as independent and take them as product of the means instead of, I have already made that crazy assumption, ignoring the spatial correlation. That's one assumption I have made. Here, I am doing something else which roughly corresponds to saying that for all the increments, so all the increments in rho, delta rho, right? Those are all some random variables, right? So it corresponds. Now, if I'm saying that, if I assume that those increments third moment onwards are not important, when is that usually true? That's same as saying that the underlying process is a Gaussian process. That is what that dropping these terms usually corresponds to. So it's sort of saying that in the eventual equation here, the delta rho's are all Gaussian. Okay, so and that's precisely why you actually get a Gaussian noise here, because I have made this assumption here. Is precisely why I get a Gaussian term, noise term here, Gaussian uncorrelated noise term here. Although that may not be the actual case in this, in fact, it probably will not be. Huh? But it's a good approximation.
Then you think about like skew or some.
Yeah. Then the thing, yeah. See, if I keep all the terms, it's same as this, which I don't know how to solve. Right? These are all tricks to be able to solve some versions of the model, huh? To get some analytical handle of the model. Yeah. Epsilon is an operator. H is an arbitrary function. Epsilon acts on anything. It's actually acting on T and P here. Okay. Is it clear to everyone? I know it's very abstract. So what we have basically done is basically a truly a mathematical trick here, but which is meaningful. Nothing wrong in doing so. Okay. It is just I am compactifying the writing of equations, and in the process I discovered that there are some additional tricks I can use with Taylor series because the increments are really small. Okay, and in general, when people do this, the increment need not be 1 over n. They just assume delta rho. Okay, so here for a given specific context, I am assuming it to be 1 over n, but it could be a delta rho in general. The point then in such a case, the term here effectively does become the expectation value of the second moment. Okay. So I know, and any other questions, do feel free to ask. I'm not in a rush to. Why is this there? So to come from, so this is the full equation. where you need to substitute these two terms. Okay. But when you do that, you have an ugly term. I can show you on my slides. On my, so the idea is that this kind of a writing notation will help us simplify. To come from there to here, you have to sit and do about 4 to 5 lines of algebra. So it's not too long. It's just about 5 lines of algebra. Carefully keeping track of terms. Is that clear to everyone? Which are the minus terms? Yes, yes. Are the minus 1 terms? No, yes, yes. Yeah. Epsilon minus, yes. Okay. So now, can we, if you now substitute this back here, what do we get? Let us look at the first term. So I'm going to this minus this will be this. Okay, minus 1 over n, right? Is that fine? So this is this term multiplied by t plus rho times p of rho t, and then we have epsilon plus minus 1, which is this term. Oh, sorry. Is that right? Times this. Which one? Yes. Right. Yeah, it is n square, yes. Okay, now you can see what happens now. Okay, I have messed up something. One of it is, this is t plus, right? And this is t minus. Okay. So now you can see that I can take these two terms together, and I can take these two terms together. Basically, I'm separating the first and second derivative terms. So what happens, I'll keep the minus sign outside. I'll keep the dou by dou rho outside. If I keep the minus sign outside, I have t plus of rho. I'm going to not write the rho dependence. You are all very familiar with it now. Minus of t minus. Okay. Times p of rho t. So the derivative is acting on the entire thing. Okay. And then, so is this clear? I have taken this term, put them together. And then I will take the second term now, 1 over 2n square, second derivative. Now what happens? It's a plus term, so t plus and t minus are getting added. And they're multiplied by this. And the second derivative acts on the entire thing. Is that clear? Oh, I have higher order terms. Huh? Is that what you meant? Actually, both. I had higher order terms here. Yes. Absolutely, yes. Okay. So the next thing I will do, is everything okay so far? The next thing immediately I will do is I will, there is an n common on both sides. So I will take up one of these n's and I will write this as 1 over 2n. So n comes here. So then I will redefine my time scaled by n, call that t prime, and then recall t prime as t. Okay. So then I had this equation. Okay. Or if you don't like that, you can just change to tau, where tau is okay. Yes. And then I'll drop this. Okay. Isn't it? T is become tau sooner than cancel. Excellent. Any other things I have missed on the board? Okay. Yes.
This time compare this to the expression for the proper plan.
I had it here.
Yeah. It's almost the same, barring like a function of.
Exactly. So that's precisely the comparison we will do now. So in fact, maybe I should write the more general expression of Foucault-Planck here, which would be just a D, if I'm right. Huh? Is that correct? What would you write otherwise?
Depending on your taste.
Sigma square.
Yeah, you might have factors of
2 or not. Yeah. I'll keep that 2. It depends on how you define eta in terms, right? Yeah. So by the way, this is a general form of Foucault-Planck equation. So now we have derived our own Foucault-Planck equation, okay, for the microscopic rules we have defined. Any questions? So basically, if you think about, again, there is algebra and there are broader concepts. If you think of broader concepts, what have we done? We defined basic microscopic rules. We defined the transition rates between states at which very small transition events happening on extremely small time scales. Then we made a few assumptions. Something called a mean field approximation that tells that any 2 points in space are highly independent, even if they are nearby. Okay, and then we used some algebraic tricks, and then we ignored some higher order changes. Under these assumptions, we now have an equation that tells us how the density of the entire landscape, the probability of the density changes with time. Okay. See, I wanted to get rid of some parameters. So, remember there was 1 over n here, 1 over n square here, right? I took 1 n outside, got it here. Okay, so it was actually 1 over n and 1 over n square, right? So I took one n to this side, then it became n divided by t. So I just redefined my time to tau. Tau now is t by n. Okay, and then the equation has one less n term. Okay, all clear so far? So, if I'm sure you can all do the algebra when you go back home, looking at the detailed notes. But this is the broad principle. So we now know how the probability density of the density is changing over time. So can I erase this? Which part should I erase? Maybe this part I can erase. This is not too. These are all algebraic details, right? Oh, I see. Yeah, it does take some. Which one? These ones? Yeah, it actually work better. They're actually lighter. They don't get stuck. So that's, I think, helps. Anyway, I think that's the best I can do. Okay. Okay. So now, having done this, let us compare this to the standard Foucault-Planck equation. So in the standard Foucault-Planck equation, we have a term called f. So what is the f here? So this is called drift, by the way. Not the drift as in evolution. This is the physics drift, okay? So this is called a drift or deterministic term. Okay, what is that? That's basically t plus of rho minus t minus of rho. And then we have something called a diffusion term. also a stochastic term. Which is given by t plus of rho minus t plus of t minus of rho. Okay. And we have a d, which is the strength of this diffusion term, which scales as 1 over the system size. Okay. Right. Thank you. Thank you for being attentive and catching all my mistakes. Okay. So now here is an interesting thing. Okay. So at some stage when we switched, when I wrote down transition rates and I switched to these notations and then used all the algebra and got it here. One thing, if you go back and redo the calculations, what will be very clear to you is that these expressions are true even if my model was actually different. Even if I had a very different model which was talking about how maybe animals are changing their behavior, how their locations are changing over time. So it doesn't matter what the state variable is, as long as t plus denoted the increment in the state variable, the rate of increment of the state variable, whereas as long as the t minus denoted the rate of decrement of the state variable, these expressions are always right. Okay, so what this tells you very interestingly is that the drift or the deterministic dynamics is determined by the difference of the increment and the decrement rates, the birth and the death rates, whereas the diffusion of stochastic term is basically summation of the two. Yes.
Maybe at this point it's not immediately obvious by looking at this why that first thing is a drift term or a deterministic term and why the second one is stochastic.
Yeah. So that should I explain or would you add a comment on that? No, why would it be called drift and diffusion?
Yeah,
okay, so now why would it be called, why is it so? So now all of you do know diffusion though, right? As a starting point. Now consider a case when the birth and death are equal. Okay, which means this now goes to 0. Now this is analogous to random walk. If the state variable was a position, probability of me going right, probability of me going left, if that is equal, then the drift becomes 0. And this becomes basically, basically these two are both constants. In fact, in the standard random walk, what would be t plus of rho? Does it depend on where I am? If rho was my location, does the transition depend on where I am? No, it's going to be half. It's going to be half. This will be half and half. So drift will be 0. Diffusion will be half plus half 1. And the coefficient will be now how big that's where the analogy slightly breaks down. But the idea is that you have this term basically drops off. You basically have a diffusion equation, right? So when this term goes off, right? So you have only you have basically in the limit of the first term drops off. We have 1 over 2n. Which is the diffusion equation. Okay, so you get diffusion equation in the limit that the two and what does now imagine the case when the transition probabilities are not equal to left and right. There is a bias, right? Let's say I'm moving to right is more likely than the left. This would then be a non-zero term. Okay, and imagine that case where I had this individual moving in this landscape example I gave last time. Your probability is not necessarily biased, but the probability of transition depends on where I am located. Right? For example, an animal moving in a home range, it's symmetric, but it does depend on how far I am from the preferred home, right? So that's the sort of analogies. And in fact, I guess the original analogy comes from the diffusion, as in the classic diffusion in physics. And the drift comes from a directionality to the process. Okay, so drift basically is a directionality that is deterministic, and given diffusion comes from the stochastic processes associated with it. What do you mean? What do you mean? Why is it stochastic? Why is that what your question is? Of course, yes.
Maybe actually related to this, sorry, but I think one thing that often can get missed when you're sort of encountering these things for the first time is, there's always these different descriptions. There's ASD, there's a Fokker-Planck, and they are describing stochastic processes, but it's not true that all the equations are stochastic in the sense that noise with output.
Yeah.
The Fokker-Planck equation is a deterministic equation. Yeah. Because it's not describing any specific trajectory.
Yeah, that's a very good. So absolutely. See, look at the fact. Well, I'll just elaborate whatever just Akshit said, which is the individual rules are stochastic, probabilistic. Then we have transition probabilities, and the master equation is actually a partial differential equation. There is no stochastic term in this, but what it is telling is how is the probability density function, how is that changing over time? Okay, for example, if you think of classic random walk again, there are two ways I can describe this, right? Which is, define how individual is moving randomly at each step and each location. You will say, no, I won't care about all those details. Please tell me if I start with the delta function of where the particle or particles were, tell me how is that profile going to change over time? That would be the diffusion equation, right? So if you think of all possible trajectories and do an average over them, and then look at how that ensemble is changing over time, that's what the master equation and Fokker-Planck equation does. And that's precisely where I go from now. We have derived up to this point now. Let us now take it as given that for a Fokker-Planck equation, which is at least univariate, meaning there is only one state variable, you can always find a unique Ito SDE. Okay. In fact, if the Fokker-Planck equation is basically this will be the unique Ito SDE. Okay. So these two are basically equivalent descriptions, except that here there is an individual trajectory that I am actually plotting. I can simulate, whereas here I am looking at the ensemble of all those trajectories. That's the basic difference between the Fokker-Planck description and the SD description. Is that clear? It's like trying to track individual trajectory of a population as against an ensemble of all of them. And they're actually equivalent descriptions, mathematically equivalent descriptions for a Gaussian noise process. Beta is a Gaussian noise. Those two are mathematically equivalent and exact descriptions. Square root of what, sorry? T.
DD.
To corresponding, yes, you're right, yeah. Thank you. Okay, in our case, it will be gone over it. Okay.
The interpretation of rho in both these equations is identical.
So this is individual trajectory dynamics. These are the ensemble of all of them.
So that would actually be the average. Oh, okay, I get it.
It's not an average. It's the entire distribution. Just to be very clear. No? Yes. That's a very good point. So, we have now derived all the mechanisms, we have now all the equations at our disposal. It's now the next task is what are the stationary distributions? Okay. So now shall we get there? So now these are the terms, and then basically if you now write down, as I just mentioned to you, we will basically have in the SDE, which is basically, let me just write the same form now because I have anyway defined f of rho. It's 1 over n in this case. Okay. So now what do we do with this? So we have this equation. What we now need to do is apply this to this specific problem. We have only 5 minutes.
Yeah, between 5 and 10.
Is it okay with everyone though? Still energetic? Very okay. So I will erase this part now because we don't need this. So what we will now do is we will actually not solve the full stochastic equation due to lack of time. What we will now do is just do the deterministic part. All of you are familiar with how to solve an equation of this type, rho dot is equal to f of rho, right? Let us see what is the deterministic. I know it sort of defeats the whole purpose. What I've been telling, let us solve stochastic part. But interesting, let us also look at what does deterministic dynamics tell us. Okay. So, a lot of my muscle energy, a lot of, I don't have to go to gym this week. Okay. So now, what is t plus? Oh, I erased t plus. Does anyone have expression for t plus and t minus? What is t plus? T plus is the birth, right? So it has to be p rho into 1 minus rho, right? T minus is rho into 1 minus p. Right? So what is f? This minus this. Okay. So now let us look at the deterministic limit. Deterministic limit basically means that n is so large that I can totally ignore the stochastic term. Okay, so sort of the whole purpose of what I am doing, trying to do is gone, but it is actually very instructive. Okay, so then what do I get? I will have d rho by dt is equal to p of rho 1 minus rho minus 1 minus p times rho. Okay, let me simplify this a bit. Let me take rho outside, and we will have p minus p rho. I've taken rho outside, p minus p rho minus rho my plus p rho. Are you sure? Yes. It just was 1 minus p. Is that right? Okay. So we will have 2p minus 1 minus p rho. Okay. Let me do one more thing. Let me take 2p minus 1 outside. So I'll have, if I made a terrible mistake, please do let me know. I'm extremely capable of doing so. So 1 minus p, also not p, rho. Let me call this a small k, okay? Where k is equal to 2p minus 1. Now tell me, how does this look like? This looks like basically, so basically what this tells you is this looks like a logistic model for those of you who have now seen this very well, where the intrinsic growth rate is given by 2p minus 1 and the carrying capacity is given by 2p minus 1 by p. And very interestingly, these two are not independent anymore, which was where when we write down the logistic model, we assume they're independent. But because they both have to come from birth and death, in our case, it was just a one parameter, so they have to be dependent. So I would like you to do this exercise. If you did assume this to be a d as an independent parameter of p, do you think k would have been an independent parameter? I would like you to check this. Okay. So, but here, at least in this model, they are not independent. Okay. So you think about the fact that there is a landscape where there are birth and death rates. We often think of carrying capacity as something that's exclusively determined by the landscape properties. But what this tells you is that it also is determined by the birth and death rates themselves. It's not entirely independent. The carrying capacity of a system is actually not. So at least if the original description of carrying capacity, other way to think about this is the original intuitive description of carrying capacity that of being, that of the landscape, doesn't always translate in the logistic model the way we think it is. In the logistic model, it actually does depend on the birth and death rates. So we actually have a logistic model that's really cool. Now, can we do a bit more? Can we analyze this a bit more? What else can we say? Yes. Because when n goes to infinity, I can drop this term entirely.
But the system is still stochastic, right? Even if you
yeah, but when n is really, really large, imagine I have 1 million cells, okay, and some fraction of it is occupied. The birth and death is changing the density a little bit here and there, but because the numbers are so large, it averages out really beautifully, and I have to only worry about the average value, not the variance. In fact, if you do simulations, you will find that to be absolutely true.
Think about Brownian motion with an infinite number of particles.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. So so this is how, and let's do one more thing. When does in logistic model, for the population to grow and reach carrying capacity, what's the condition? What's the bare minimum condition?
Non-zero.
Non-zero intrinsic growth rate. The R has to be greater than 0, right? So when is that true here? Okay, let me do it more systematically, because I do have 2 more minutes, right? So when you have an equation, what do you do? When you have an ordinary differential equation that describes dynamics or something, what do? You find the fixed points and stability. What are the fixed points for this? Rho is equal to 0, right? And okay, so when is rho is equal to 0 stable? The rho is equal to 0 is stable when the coefficient of the linear term is negative. One is, this means if P is less than half. So what this tells you is that unless the probability of reproduction is half, the entire landscape will only have zeros. Okay. So it has to be greater than half. Okay. So in fact, this is also called an inactive state. This is called an inactive state because there is no activity. If everything is 0, nothing happens. So there are no births, there are no deaths. Everything is 0. The entire, both the processes, neither of them happen. Everything is 0 all the time. It's called an absorbing state because once everything is 0, nothing again wakes up out of nowhere, and it's an inactive state. Okay. Yes.
So I'm thinking of the same P equals half, or every case with P equals half, right? And so if you plug it into the P plus and P minus expressions, P minus will be greater than P plus because rho times 1 minus rho. I mean,
that can't be possible. I mean, if P is equal to half, I mean, unless I have done an algebra mistake here, it has to be 0.
Wait, P is equal to
it's
half.
An equilibrium, right? Yeah. Yeah.
No. Okay, so if P is equal to half, so P minus is rho times 1 minus P, right? So it's half rho.
No, F need not be 0. F will be negative. The growth rate will be negative.
Sorry, my point is growth rate will be negative. Yes, yes. So
yeah.
P plus minus P minus negative.
Has to be negative for P less than half. Okay. So that everything will be flowing towards 0. The density flows to 0. Yes. No, it has to be true. Okay. Now it turns out by the way, remember this is the prediction of the mean field approximation. If you actually go back to a lattice and do a simulation, you will find that this is not necessarily correct. Okay, I'll come to that very soon. Let's now do the other part. So this will be stable for P greater than half. If you now do a bifurcation diagram, so because we're running out of time, I'm sure you can do this yourself. This is how it looks like. It reaches 1 at 1. Okay. This is how the deterministic prediction of this mean field approximation looks like. If we actually go and simulate these rules on a computer and check what happens, this is not precisely what you find, but qualitatively yes. It turns out that the actual critical point is around 6.1 approximately, and then it does this. Okay. So the mean field approximation that we did does a good job of predicting the qualitative features of the overall dynamics, but it fails in terms of the exact critical point where the ones can begin to survive. And what is interesting is that in the real simulations, unless the probability of birth is more than 0.61 or so, nobody survives. Everything becomes basically 0. Okay.
Substituting for G, you have expression for G.
I have not used it at all in this analysis because it is deterministic. Okay.
Explain how P encapsulates not.
Okay, I can do that. So basically, so where should I erase? I think I can erase this part. But I think we can also break now and people can go for tea, and I can discuss with those who are, because it's already very long, 1.5 hours.
Yeah,